In our hobbies, you sometimes end up meeting people you regret. Not just regret meeting, but regret that you are forced to live in the same world as them. Regret that you can both somehow share some joy in the same activity. Regret that you both have shared the same air. I managed to stumble upon a gathering of these types. With circumstances keeping me from fleeing, I ended up spending a weekend with them. My friend makes bad decisions. He's a good guy, just as long as you don't let him decide anything. As long as someone is deciding things for him, there's no problems. But the second he's left to his own devices, he will almost always come up with the absolute worst ideas. His exploits are carved into his body, with burns and scars from the dumbest of accidents, and he's even missing part of his ear thanks to an infection he got from trying to pierce it himself. Sadly, I'm not too bright myself, and often forget that I'm never supposed to listen to any of his suggestions. So when he decided we should join a fantasy LARP, I agreed. We, my bad decision-making friend, one other, and myself, had gone LARPing in the past, way back in high school, and it was pretty bad, but we were too young to know that. We ended up going to 6 of the monthly events, which was how long it took for us to understand the live-action roleplay and to figure out just how bad it was. The way it worked was that it really only made sense to go if you had already been going there for years. We stopped going once we realized just how slow the character progression actually was, and that it would take us roughly 3 to 4 years before we'd even be above peasant status, and another 3 or 4 before we'd even be a little below average. While this may not be a problem at other LARPs, it meant that we would be doing nothing but running for help whenever there was a problem for all that time. While the other friend and I had abandoned it, my misguided friend continued for a bit, going to events every once in a while, still chasing the dream of eventually gaining enough power to be able to go outside the inn without having to ask people to come along and protect him. Eventually, even he stopped, mostly because he didn't want to keep paying the fee. A few years later, he managed to catch wind of a new LARP that had launched, an offshoot of the original one started up by disgruntled members who were tired of the bullshit from the first. He was excited about it and kept talking about how they were going to change things and make it better. I knew it was just going to be the same old problems and a new packaging, and I decided not to go. While at first I was adamant about my refusal, his enthusiasm was rather contagious, especially because each month he'd come back and would not shut up about how awesome it was. Eventually, my memories of the previous LARP started to blend with both nostalgia and wishful thoughts on how I had hoped things would have gone. The other friend, the one who had gone with us before, ended up giving in first and agreed to go to it. About a year after it had started up, with no real reason not to go beyond a bad previous experience at a different LARP, I decided that we might as well all go. As we drove to the campsite where the LARP would take place, the 3 of us slowly converted back into our young high school days, filled with innocence, optimism, and that childlike love of fantasy and pretend. We decided to get into character, starting off with only referring to each other by our character names. The friend who had been going to the LARP for the past year was Hardul Nightwater, a mage. The other friend planned on reviving his old character, Lith Cloud, who was a hardy warrior. And I decided on reviving my old character as well, Nephim Festiva, who would use both magic and weapons. Hardul kept telling us about this and that and how awesome everything was. He gave me tips on what good magic spells were, and explained little nuances about the way combat was handled. Since the system was still fairly new, not everything had really been ironed out, and even Hardul said he didn't really think he had figured it all out by now. Lith kept discussing plans on reviving our old adventuring party, Cerberus, and maybe even spending enough time and effort into eventually turning it into a noble house or clan. When we arrived on Friday afternoon, things seemed pretty good. In fact, the campground seemed awesome. They were some distance away from the closest town, and had plenty of wooded areas as well as flat fields. I was still filled with optimism, and could barely wait to go out and adventure and roleplay. I lost a lot of that optimism very quickly with the very first person I saw. High Lord Ulsic. Or at least, that's what he called himself at the old LARP. An overweight man in his late 40s or early 50s. He would braid his hair and beard in a way I assumed he thought was very medieval or fantasy looking, but instead looked like he had just come back from a teenage girl's sleepover. He always looked like he was scowling, except for when he made eye contact with someone, when he would open his small eyes wide and give the most unnatural smile a person could give. He was responsible for some of the worst, including the very worst, memories at the old LARP. He had been a noble and enjoyed ordering people around, especially during the big battles. Disobeying him was apparently a huge offense, and he had actually incarcerated Lith in a little fake jail room for leaving his position during a big battle. Lith had rushed out to help Hardul, who had somehow been left out in the open, which created a gap in the line that the enemies took advantage of. He spent 2 hours in that little room before I managed to convince another noble to release him, and even then, only after he took almost all of our gold. As High Lord Ulsic ambled over towards us, I cast a sideways glance at my friends, with Lith appearing rather passive, while somewhat disturbingly, Hardul seemed rather happy about seeing Ulsic. With his loud and forcedly gruff voice, Ulsic greeted Hardul and then asked who we were. Having forgotten us in the many years since we had last met, we introduced ourselves anew, and while I did it so I wouldn't appear rude by saying we had met before, he had simply just forgotten us. Lith did it because he had completely forgotten the man. Rather quickly, Hardul changed. Talking with Ulsic, his voice and mannerisms became more and more exaggerated, until I could barely recognize him. Using lofty and often silly-sounding language with complete seriousness, I had to stifle a somewhat mean-spirited chuckle at his earnest role-playing. I then realized that the event hadn't actually started yet, and that neither Ulsic nor Hardul were actually in character yet. Lith seemed to be paying attention to their conversation, but I was more interested in the other people that were arriving. A parade of various outcasts, most of them were male and in their 30s. A handful of teenagers kept together in clumps here and there, and eventually people in their 20s began to appear. Most were overweight, while the exceptions were exceptionally thin. Judging purely by appearance, it didn't seem like either me or Lith would have any real athletic competition besides each other. Even Hardul, who was somewhat out of shape, could probably challenge most of the people there to a fist fight and have a good chance at winning. After everyone, a large amount, probably over 100 people, had gathered around the parking lot, we made our way to the large main cabin. It had already been decorated with candles and various fantasy materials, probably taken straight out of a Halloween store, and we went through the registration process, which included being assigned our cabins. Lith and I had to make our characters, and I was pleased to see that we had a fair amount of options. With the amount of points you started with, you were able to choose different abilities. Lith made a straightforward warrior, specializing in a one-handed sword and large shield style. He went mostly for raw statistics, increasing his HP all the way to 22 and spending a fair amount of points to raise the damage of his sword to the next level, from 3 to 4. Overall, it seemed solid, if not a little generic. I tweaked around and ended up with primarily a mage that could also use a two-handed sword. 14 HP seemed like it was a bit low, but it was better than the 10 HP other starting mages typically had, and the two-handed sword dealt a solid 4 damage, even without raising it to the next level. As for my spells, I decided on 2 offensive fire ones. One that dealt 1 damage, but I could use as much as I wanted, and one that dealt 7 damage that I could use once a day. I also picked an ice one that made my target forced to stand in the same spot. He could move his arms, but not his feet. And a healing spell that I could use 3 times a day to cure 4 HP. To use a spell, I would say the spell name and then throw or touch my target with a small beanbag of various sizes, some only an inch long and wide, while others were the size of my hands, while most fell somewhere in between. When we had the characters finished and registered, we went over to Hardul, who was with 3 other people, including Ulsic. The event had not yet started, so everyone was still in their everyday clothing, and they were discussing the game itself. I listened in and discovered a few things that I probably would have liked to know before I had come here. As told by Ulsic himself, he had played a vital role in starting this LARP, and wasn't merely a player, but a partial owner and one of the 3 head plot masters. It also seemed that during this event, Hardul was actually going to become a noble, a count, who would serve beneath the Archduke Ulsic, who was using the same name as his character from the last LARP. Lith was very happy hearing this, because it meant that the adventuring party Cerberus had already taken its first step towards becoming a full-fledged noble house. The event started after an hour, with dinner. By that time, everyone had changed into their costumes, while me and Lith wore what could barely be called costumes, and there were some teenagers who shared our shirt and pants fashion sense. Everyone else had elaborate costumes and makeup, robes, capes, frilly shirts, full body paint, and there were even 2 people who wore wolf fur suits. They were playing a werewolf type race, and I barely recognized Hardul, dressed in a purple robe with a full cape and hood and odd rune-like shapes painted on his face. He also must not have recognized us, as he walked past both of us as he headed towards a different table. Feeling somewhat miffed about the cold shoulder, we walked over to him. He told us that he and his noble house had some plot-related things they needed to discuss, and that he wasn't allowed to tell us. This was understandable, so Lith and I walked back to the other table, and started chatting with the people around us. It was odd at first, and I could hear myself matching the rough, low, and unnatural voices everyone else was using. Lith seemed to get the flow of things faster than I did, and I guess I was just being a little too judgmental at first. But soon, I was just talking normally to them without any odd accent, expressing my opinion as my character would. I think I started to get the hang of it when me and Lith were ushered into the new player training. Besides the 2 of us, there were 8 teenagers, and 2 other 20-somethings. Among them, I noticed someone that clearly stood out. Among the women who I had seen so far, all were borderline grotesque. Even with layers of heavy makeup and robes, they still required a moment to get used to after the initial shock of their appearance. This one, however, was rather cute. She was standing away from the 2 clumps of teenagers and the other 20-year-olds, looking nervous and confused, which calmed me down for some reason. Eventually, an old man walked up to us. He must have been over 60, judging by his wrinkles and white hair. However, he was in surprisingly good shape. Enough that made me wonder whether he was in better shape than Lith or me. With a calm yet commanding voice, he started to explain the rules of combat as we walked toward the cave. The cave is a cabin where the monsters would spawn from. Monsters were people who either volunteered and didn't have to pay the event fee, or were conscripted from the players for a few hours if there weren't enough. It was also the place they stored the monster costumes and a huge collection of foam, duct tape, and PVC pipe weapons. Combat had very simple rules: avoid the head, try not to hurt anyone, and that you had to call out your damage each time you swung. When we finally reached the cave, he explained that we would now spend the rest of the night as monsters as a bit of practice, and then the next 2 days we'd play as heroes. Stepping inside the cave, I felt my blood boil with excitement. Apparently, all the athletic people spent their time as monsters. When we entered, there were 2 of them wailing at each other with foam weapons, hitting with enough force to make the old man tell them to stop setting a bad example for us. Beyond them being athletic, they almost universally had the same evil smirk on their face, which was noticeable enough for even Lith to whisper to me that he thought they all looked like sadists. When the 2 of them didn't stop, the old man stepped in between them and shouted an order for them to stop, at which point they went into another room. We then got outfitted as grunks, which the old man described as rat-like humanoids, wearing brown, furry cloth and wielding foam daggers. The 13 of us went out. The old man led us skillfully, sniffing the air at intersections and directing us with short barks and hand signs. In moments, we were all grunks, searching for unprepared heroes ready to slaughter. The first group we met was a lone warrior, who was absolutely shocked to see us. The old man motioned for me and Lith to surround him, and the 3 of us stabbed the warrior several times before he managed to run past the old man, right into the waiting daggers of the rest of the group. We continued on, all of us fairly pleased. Then we stumbled into Ulsik. Ulsik had an entourage of 5 people with him, which was still less than half our number. Even so, I knew that we were all going to die. Though, when we died, we would just lie down, wait until all the heroes left, and then get back up. Thinking it a good chance to at least take down one of these nobles, I was more than ready for the old man's order to rush in. I ran in, trying to get around the warrior with the shield protecting Ulsik. Just as I broke past him, Ulsik threw down a beanbag, shouting, "Firestorm, 10 damage!" Unsure what just happened, I continued to move until Ulsik shouted, "Every enemy within a 50-foot radius of me takes 10 damage. With all of us having 5 HP, we simply laid down. I couldn't help but feel somewhat pissed, but the old man seemed rather happy about the outcome. He explained that a monster's job wasn't to kill players, but to be killed by them. And it was a good lesson about just how powerful one of the strongest people in the game was, especially compared to one of the weakest creatures. We got up and journeyed around for a few more hours. We mostly ended up getting killed from a distance, but occasionally we managed to get killed in melee. Though I could dodge and block fairly well, each dagger only dealt 1 damage, meaning even against a weak caster, I'd need 10 hits before he dropped, and it took 1 or 2 hits to take me down. I started to get foolishly frustrated, even though I knew I was just playing a really weak monster. It was a strange sense of futility I received from that experience, and I definitely didn't want to repeat it. Afterwards, we went back to the cave, put away the stuff, and then went to our assigned cabins. Once I arrived at Lith's and mine, I realized that Hardul was in a different cabin. Lith asked me why Hardul wasn't in ours, and I could only reply that it must be because he's part of a noble house. When we went to sleep, exhausted from having been rats for so long, when we got up, we looked for Hardul. We found him in the main cabin inn, talking to a noble. He told us that yesterday he was officially granted his title as a count, and now he could initiate us into Ulsik's noble house. Lith was very excited about this, while I guess I was less enthusiastic. Hardul said we should go adventuring right after breakfast, which I guess I was very excited about. We went out, and I quickly realized I didn't serve much of a purpose. Hardul had been part of this LARP since it had started, and his character was several times stronger than either mine or Lith's. Lith would stand between a monster and Hardul would lob a spell he could cast that dealt 10 damage, often killing our enemies in 2 shots. We found 3 monsters after 2 hours of walking around, which apparently was a pretty high amount, especially during the morning hours. When lunch came around, Hardul said he had something he needed to do, so he left us in the inn. After talking to a few people, Lith and I decided to go out and adventure on our own. Leaving the inn, we set out on the same path we had taken with Hardul. We met our first monster, a troll. I hadn't really seen any of the monsters get a chance to fight while Hardul had been with us, and though the 3 of us had taken out a troll earlier, I only had a vague idea of how strong it was. Of course, it dealing 8 damage with its foam club at least told us that it was much stronger than we were. The man who was playing the troll was skilled, but not cleverly so. His attacks just kept on getting caught by Lith's sword or shield, while I kept cutting at him with my 2-handed sword, using its long reach to keep me at a safe distance. After 10 hits, he dropped, and we went on our way. Lith had taken a hit, but with 14 HP remaining, we decided to save my healing spells for a more dire need, because I could stabilize a person brought to less than 0 HP so they wouldn't die. On our route, we encountered one of the werewolf people. He was accompanied by a fat woman dressed like a warrior, and when we told them we were just going around looking for adventure, they told us that they were actually looking for help. They wanted to go to a field where they had been told there was treasure, but they also knew it was guarded by trolls. When we told them we had taken down a troll only minutes ago, the woman stopped and asked us what level we were. When I explained it was our first event, she couldn't believe it. Either way, the 2 of them decided to let us come with them. When we arrived at the field, there were 3 trolls, I assumed, standing beneath a tree, a small box between them. As soon as they saw us, 2 of them moved out towards us, the last remaining behind. Lith and I moved towards one, while the wolf and woman moved towards the other. This one was more skilled than the last, and quickly scored a hit on Lith for 9 damage. With only 5 HP left, Lith was in a bad situation. As he moved back, I moved forward, attacking more carelessly, just trying to get as much damage in as possible. I pressed the troll back, but just when I thought I'd get in the last few hits, I took 9 damage in the back. Moving quickly to the side, I turned to see both the werewolf and the woman lying on the ground, the troll they were fighting now attacking me. With the situation turning against us rapidly, I did some quick calculations. These were definitely stronger than the troll we had faced before, but hopefully not by much. If the first troll had about 40 plus HP, then the troll we had been fighting was probably a hit or 2 away from dying. Pulling out my beanbags, I began to throw them at him, calling out my weak fire spell. After 4 hits, he dropped, just as the other troll managed to land a strike on Lith, dropping him. Lith had done fairly well against it though, and as I hit the troll with my strong fire spell, it dropped as well. I learned later that trolls take double damage from fire spell, which is probably the major reason we managed to take them down. I quickly healed up Lith back to 4 HP, with 1 healing spell, but as I moved towards the werewolf and woman, the 3rd troll started running towards us. As he neared, Lith shouted, "What do I see?" at him, since the rags he was wearing could mean anything. He replied, "A troll much bigger than the rest." With both of us being one hit away from death, we had to make a hard decision. In a way, I ended up not having to make it. Lith ran first, and I immediately followed. Looking back, I saw the troll begin chasing after us. Seeing how fast he ran, I suddenly realized something. Spinning around, I began running towards the troll, a bit slower than I'm fully capable of. He continued to run at me, until he came close enough to swing at me. He swung hard, but I just ran right past him, at which point he realized what I was after. Sprinting now as fast as I could, I reached the small chest and managed to pick it up just before he reached me. He swung again, but I managed to dodge and start running, sword in one hand, chest in the other. I managed to get out of the field and ran down the path, all the way to the inn, where Lith was trying to get a rescue crew together. I showed him the chest, and opened it to find 30 gold, an absolute fortune, along with 2 magical rings. I was rather happy with myself, not realizing how much I was going to regret my actions later. Within the inn was a healer, and both Lith and I were healed back to our full HP. We then led the crew of 6 people to the field, where both the werewolf and woman were gone, and the lone troll was under the tree. The 6 surrounded the troll, but even then it was a hard fight, as it probably had well over 200 HP, though I quickly lost count. Eventually it dropped, and when I asked where the werewolf and woman were, I learned how death works in this game. After your HP goes below 0, you have 5 minutes where you can still be healed by normal healing spells, like mine. After that 5, you have 10 minutes where you can be healed by advanced healing spells, and after that, you are dead, and need to be resurrected, which means you lose both money and experience. More than 15 minutes had passed for the wolf and woman, which meant they simply stood up and walked back to the inn to get resurrected. I felt bad for those 2, but it meant that both Lith and I would be the only ones to split the treasure. To explain how much a single piece of gold is, you typically might be able to get 3 pieces of gold at an event, if you work hard. Getting 15, split between me and Lith, on the first day meant we could basically buy excellent gear for ourselves and still have some gold left over. Thinking about our good fortune, I didn't even suppose that I have any sort of problem immediately as I returned to the inn, especially not because the woman had, somehow, while she was unconscious, managed to see me run past the troll to get the treasure chest as opposed to come over to them and heal them, an ability I had only shown I was capable of after she had been knocked unconscious, and her being a part of Ulric's noble house didn't help matters. The woman had been telling her story in the inn while we were out trying to save her, and as we returned she pointed me out as the guy who cared more about gold than people's lives. At first, the 6 who had come with us supported me, saying that I was new and I didn't know how death worked, and I still went back to help her. This was quickly drowned out by her mentioning that I had not even bothered to offer any portion of the chest's treasure. Things immediately turned even more sour. No one in the rescue party had even known about the treasure chest until they had heard her story, and they suddenly became very interested in why they, the people who had managed to kill the troll, did not deserve the treasure. The woman who had died, realizing that everyone was now caring more about the treasure than they did about her dying, began to harp even louder about just how terrible of a person I was. I quickly offered them each 5 pieces of gold, thinking to keep the 2 rings for me and Lith. But they were more curious as to why I hadn't offered this to them before they had set out. I was in a very bad situation. If I explained that I had felt that I had earned the entire treasure, would have been completely content leaving that troll alive and the 2 corpses where they were, there was no way that would have gone over well. However, my silence as I tried to piece together what to say instead didn't really help my case, especially because during that silence, Archduke Ulrich decided to make his appearance. Another person from his house told him what happened, and he listened calmly, silently, making an odd head-bobbing motion every once in a while. As the story finished, he walked over to me and told me to step outside with him. He's an easy man to dislike. He started out by telling me exactly what had happened, what everyone didn't know. The huge amount of treasure, an extraordinary amount, had been placed especially for the werewolf and the woman to receive. They were actually waiting in the forest for 2 NPCs, who, unbeknownst to them, were going to use nothing but an infinite amount of heal spells and let them fight the trolls until they won. I stood, listening to this, and I guess, somewhat angrily, asked what any of that had to do with me. He explained, calmly, slowly, that I'd snatched away something that I didn't deserve, and that I could potentially imbalance the game if I used that gold. I said that wasn't going to be a problem, because I had already promised to give the gold away to the 6 people who had come with us. He grew furious. He asked me if I knew what I had done, how I had taken the gold and now made it so that it could no longer be easily returned without upsetting all those players. How would this cheapen the entire gold economy, and how I had single-handedly devalued every magical item in the game. I said he must be exaggerating, and he said that there was no way I could understand. He then stood silent, apparently thinking hard, until he gave me the absolute worst smile I've ever seen in my entire life. He told me that he had a solution. Being an absolute idiot, I smiled back, thinking that the man would just magically smooth away the problem. As he went inside, he said that I was being convicted of murder, that through my negligence I had let 2 people unjustly die, and that for my crime, I would be executed through decapitation. Absolute silence followed, so he continued. He said that leaving a nobles of his house to die was the same as leaving him to die. I would be an example to all, so that anyone who claims to be a hero will never make the same mistake of being overcome by greed, and, as a lesson to all, the state would seize all of my assets. I looked at the crowd, waiting for a reaction, waiting for someone to scream, "Bullshit," or "He's a brand new player," or "You've gone mad with power." Instead, the first one to say something was that fat, disgusting woman who I'm glad I had inadvertently killed and only wished she would have stayed dead, who shouted, "Long live Archduke!" The crowd slowly erupted in the chant, and to my horror I realized that Hardul was among them. I looked for Lith's face in the crowd, and was equally dismayed to see a look of absolute indifference, one that said, "It's just a game. This might actually be fun." I could only shoot him a pleading glance, followed by an angry one at Hardul. He actually paused, but one look from Archduke was more than enough to get him going again. The Archduke, with an utter look of triumph, simply picked up the chest and walked away, leaving me to the other nobles. I was then led into the jail, an unused closet with barely enough room for me to stand. I was told that I was supposed to wait there until my execution, the time of which would be decided by the Archduke. They then closed the door, leaving me in the cramped darkness. I waited in the darkness of the small closet, collecting my thoughts, trying to come to terms with what was happening. In a way, I was actually fortunate to have that little time out, as it gave me time to think and question. I began to question what my next line of action was. My first option, and the most obvious one, was to just accept the sentence. Being executed meant that I would be permanently killed, in a way that prevented resurrection. I was a first-level character, and starting up a new character wouldn't really change much. More importantly, it was the only choice that was presented to me, as neither negotiating for a fair trial nor escaping really seemed like options. But every fiber of who I was did not want to be executed, even if it was just for pretend in a pretend world. Even if the circumstances around it were all make-believe, my innocence was real. Every ounce of rebellious spirit that I had in me said to find some way out of this mess, to oppose the tyrannical decision of Ulsik and the apathy of the populace that enabled it. Even though I had found my resolve, I still could not find any way to remedy my situation. Hardul and Lith came to visit me. Leading me out of the cramped closet, they tried to convince me that all I really could do was accept the execution, and try to make it a fun role-playing experience. I told them that they could have a fun role-playing experience in helping me escape. With a rather downcast look, Hardul explained that there was no way he could oppose Ulsik, especially because it was because of him that he had finally become a noble. Not to mention that Ulsik was possibly the strongest person in the game. Lith simply said that it would be easier for me to just make a new character, rather than try to iron out all the problems this one had. He even said I could make him identical to Nephim, except I'd have to change his name. We argued a bit more, until it became clear that they wouldn't help me willingly. I then asked them why they had even bothered to come see me, if all they were going to do was tell me my only choice was death. At this point, Hardul actually became somewhat angry, telling me that it had not been easy for him to come see me, and that he actually had to use his rank as a noble to get this chance. I responded with the question of whether he had actually bothered to take me out of my cramped cell. Looking at the closet I was no longer in, Hardul, calming down slightly, said that it was obvious that he had, not realizing my intention, and I bolted. I was almost out the door before either of them realized what I was doing. They began to shout, but by the time someone took notice, I was a good, safe distance away. A low-level mage tried to throw spells at me, but his spells were short, and a moment later I disappeared into the woods. Running far, deep into the middle of the camping grounds, I found a small ring of dense bushes in a wooded spot that was well away from the main roads. Moving into the center of them and feeling rather secure about not being spotted within them, I sat down and began to think of what to do next. Before I decided anything else, I realized I needed to get myself prepared. In order to be a fugitive, I needed to get 3 major things: food, a place to sleep, and perhaps the most important, a weapon. Once I had those 3, I could decide on what to do next. Food and a place to sleep were the problem. Meals were purchased at the inn, which was also the place where I was sure to find plenty of people who could kill me with a glance. Beyond that, I had brought a fair amount of snacks with me, probably enough so that I wouldn't have to buy any food for the weekend. However, all these snacks were in my bags, which were in my cabin. That was also the place I was expected to sleep, which meant it was the place I was expected to go, which meant it was the place I expected they would try to catch me. If I was to even try to go there, I wanted to at least be armed with more than just a few beanbags. My character could only use a 2-handed sword. Other mages typically could use daggers and small swords, but I had taken those points and added them just so I could use my 2-handed sword. My choice was made under the assumption that I'd never need or want to use a smaller sword, but now I was in a really bad situation. In order for me to get a new weapon, I had 3 options. Stealing an unattended one that a person owned meant that I had to get a specially sanctioned witness, which I knew was a stupid idea. I could always just break the rules, but that was grounds for being kicked out of the game itself. If I was going to do this, I was going to do this without anyone being able to condemn me for opposing the spirit of the game. If I broke a rule, nothing I did would matter, since they would just retcon anything. I had to beat them at their own game, with their own rules. That left either taking one from a fallen person, or I could just grab one from the piles of the cave. Neither of these options seemed very practical. There were very few players who used 2-handed swords, and beyond just finding them, I'd have to defeat them, unarmed. Going to the cave seemed smarter, since players avoided going near it and there was undoubtedly weapons there, but I also had an enormous chance of running into a monster, who'd be more likely able to outrun me, considering the monsters I had seen were more athletic than the players. While I considered my options, I heard voices coming close. I knew that I was fairly safe within these bushes, invisible unless they decided to force their way through them, but I was still extremely nervous. Holding my breath with the amateur thought that it would keep them from hearing me, as I listened, I realized that they were 3 teenagers, one who I remembered quite clearly because of his awkward, cracking voice that was an absolute challenge to respond to with the mindset that he was playing a gruff and strong warrior. Peering out from the bushes as they passed some distance away, I was very glad I had chosen neutral grays for my outfit, rather than the flashy colors that seemed to be in fashion here. The 3 of them, all warriors, though none with a 2-handed sword, wore bright colors that encouraged me to think of them as targets. Without a plan formed, I slowly slid out of the bushes. Then, cautiously, silently, I moved after them. While I was still a good distance away, I threw my ice spell at the closest one, calling out the spell's name in the most intimidating voice I could, hitting him squarely in the back. He froze in good faith of role-playing, while the other 2 wheeled nervously around. I hit the second one before he had a chance to move, and the third kept close to his friends while I bandaged another beanbag. Counting down the 30 seconds in my head, I had very little time before the 3 of them tried to rush me. While my aim was solid, I doubted that I could hit them all without the element of surprise, especially since I only managed to hit 2 while I had it. I asked them first what they were doing, and with a strange, obliging obedience, the lone mobile one answered curtly. Apparently, I had a 30 gold bounty on my head. This was such an obscene amount of money for just catching such a weak fugitive, and I didn't blame them for trying to hunt me. I, however, was not going to just lie down and let them take me without a challenge. With the 30 seconds almost up, I knew I'd have to run. Looking back in the opposite direction of them, I realized my cabin was in that direction, and with a burst of inspiration, I ran directly at them. The 3 teens panicked, with no real reason, considering I didn't have a weapon, but I kept well out of all 3 swords' ranges, running around them in the opposite direction, my cabin. I made an emphasis on my speed, running with the intent that no sane person would try to keep up with me, until I was a good distance away from the encounter. Seeing that I had no pursuers, I stopped to catch my breath, wondering whether I could keep up such a pace all day. I continued on a little further in that direction before I looped around, with the guess that the 3 were heading towards the inn, telling everyone that they had spotted me and where they thought I was going. If I had any chance at getting my stuff from the cabin, this was it. The campgrounds were pretty large, and it could easily take more than an hour to walk from one end to the other. With a floating map fuzzily drawn in my mind, I tried to predict where people would be and where they'd be heading. Thankful for the extensive traveling I had done on the grounds as a grunk, this may sound like a pretty impressive ability, but it was me mostly trying to figure out how to avoid the main roads and taking the smaller paths. I did fairly well for myself, using a few paths that were practically hidden that I would have never have known had I not been shown by the old man who led us, and managed to get close to my cabin with only hearing people in the distance. However, just as I neared it, voices surprised me from just beyond a bend in the path that I was taking. I dove into the woods, glad that the road was somewhat elevated and that I had basically dropped into a ditch. A large group appeared from beyond the bend, and I nervously knew that I had no chance of staying undiscovered if they continued down the path. Thankfully, they took an earlier fork and moved away on a different, larger path, but I managed to catch snippets of their conversation. My guess had been correct, and they had been waiting for me at my cabin, and while they agreed that 30 gold was way too much for just capturing me, they, however, were not complaining. As soon as they had gone a good distance, I moved out of the ditch, dusting myself off. I didn't waste any more time and rushed into my cabin. With haste, I gathered my snacks together into my small sleeping bag, downing a candy bar and a bag of chips in the process. While it wasn't the most nutritious meal, it at least satisfied me. What was the greater satisfaction was that I managed to outwit everyone into thinking I was elsewhere. Except Lith. Lith stood at the entrance, blocking it. His sword and shield were readied, and the look on his face said that this was not going to end well. Even so, I greeted him, telling him I planned on being a fugitive and that I could use all the help I could get. He responded simply, telling me that Hardul was no longer a noble, that he had been demoted because he let me escape, and that now there was very little chance that Cerberus would become a noble house. I told Lith that it wasn't my fault, that it wasn't Hardul's fault, that all of this was because of Ulsik. I even wanted to tell him about Ulsik's whole plan with the original treasure, but I realized that wouldn't sway him an inch. He just looked at me, knowing that I was unarmed, and calmly said that I should have just made a new character. I replied, slowly, knowing that I would regret the scene that followed. I said that I was just doing what my character would do, that all I was doing was role-playing, the thing we came here to do. Lith agreed. He said that was what we came here to do, and that he was going to do now just what his character would do, that all this was going to do was roleplay. He lunged forward. Hardul and Lith had both been giving me advice while I made my character, and both of them knew I had built him wrong. Compared to a pure warrior, I had lower stats across the board. Compared to a pure spellcaster, I had only a fraction of their spells, and with the amount of times that they could cast them. Worse still, I decided to not specialize in a single school of magic, which meant that I had only the weakest of all 3 schools, except for the 7 damage fire spell, which is the second weakest of the fire school. In the end, my character could not be a mage because he could not rely on his spells, and was far weaker than any other fighter. However, in this exact situation, to both Lith's and my regret, I was invincible. As he lunged forward, I hit him with my ice spell. He was still blocking the lone exit, so he began to count to 30 aloud, trying to show me how futile that spell was. I then hit him with my 1 damage fire spell. I then hit him again. It then dawned on him what my plan was. Combining the schools of fire and ice, I had no chance of losing. He had no ranged attacks, no defenses, nothing he could do. As the 30 seconds expired, I hit him with another ice spell, and then continued. His 22 HP dwindled away rapidly until he was left with a single hit point. I renewed the ice spell and then told him that he should run to the inn and get healed. He was furious at first, but he seemed to realize just how terrible it would be for me to be the one to kill his character. As he nodded in agreement, I put down my hand, glad that this had not turned out worse. As the ice spell expired, he lunged towards me. He would have hit me. He had actually surprised me, shocked me to the point where there was no way I could have consciously reacted. Had I not been casting the same fire spell over and over again for the last 5 minutes, I probably would have been captured right there, unable to defend myself against him after he had closed the gap between us. But the spell had been drilled into my mind, and I reflexively acted, tossing the beanbag at him before I came within his reach. As he dropped to the ground, defiantly silent, I panicked. I needed to get a healer to him quickly, but there was no way for a fugitive to do so. Where I go to the inn, I would simply be captured and killed, and even then there was little chance a healer would reach Lith in time. Finding one by chance on the road was a long shot as well, and I was very much more likely to just run into a group of bounty hunters and monsters. With a glance at my watch, I saw that he had very little time before his first 5 minutes were up, meaning he would require advanced healing, not just basic healing spells like I had. After I realized how stupid I was, I found myself debating whether or not I should use one of my 2 remaining healing spells on a person I myself had damaged. I knew that I was going to need them later if I was expecting to survive as a fugitive, and there'd be no other way I could get healing. Knowing Lith would never forgive me if I was the one that killed him, it became a very easy choice. I kicked aside his sword and shield well out of his reach. Grabbing my sleeping bag, I knelt down beside of him, apologizing that things had to turn out like this. As soon as I healed him, before he could get up, I hit him with an ice spell. I then ran out of the cabin, food and sleeping gear triumphantly in tow, but wondering if it had been worth it.